Good afternoon. I'm happy to welcome Professor Sharafutdinova from the King's College London. Thank you for being here with us today. ICAR is currently interviewing international experts in order to understand better what is really going on these days in Ukraine. Well, you're a professor for Russian politics at the King's Russia Institute, who has done extensive research on Russian identity and the legacy of the Soviet Union. Well, at the moment, Russia has invaded Ukraine. Intense fighting has been reported since the early morning hours in Kiev, and the information we have at the moment is changing constantly. So I would like to ask you a few questions. Do you think that the sanctions measures which the EU and the UK have taken are effective?
Yeah, the sanctions are mostly economic in nature. They are very serious. I think the leaders, the officials who prepared these sanctions do realize that they're not going to work immediately, but they are aiming at crippling the Russian economy in the long term. And on the ground, with prices rising, with the queues to the banks, with Russian citizens' efforts to somehow compensate for what's to come, we do see that they have to a certain extent affected the situation already. But it's the longer term effect of sanctions that's that was in the mind of those who have created it. They are mostly economic in nature, and Putin has early on announced that those sanctions are going to stop him.
But you just said Putin has announced that these sanctions are going to stop him.
Yeah, all the government officials and the Russian president have been very open about not stopping the aggression because of sanctions.
Okay, thank you for clarifying. Well, and do you think that there will be more sanctions put in place, or what will be the next step, the exclusion from the SWIFT system?
Yes, there is a high likelihood, and I think the negotiations about taking Russia out of the SWIFT system of interbank payments and information exchange is being discussed as we speak. To my understanding, there are two countries in Europe, Hungary and Germany, that have been opposed to this sanction, but they are also open to convincing, I think, as the situation evolves. Another new sanction that was just imposed last night by the European Union is personal sanctions on Vladimir Putin and Sergei Lavrov. The sanction that was not yet imposed after the beginning of invasion on 24th. So we do see a certain degree of unfolding of these sanctions, and I think the biggest ones have been introduced, but there must be some others that are in the books or in the conversation, and other reactions that go beyond sanctions, I'm sure, are in discussion as well. Although the American, the US government and the European governments have been clear about not getting involved in Ukraine militarily.
And would you say that there is a difference between the approaches taken by the UK and the EU in regards to the current crisis?
I think the Western governments have shown a high degree of unity and coordination in their responses. The UK government has been known to be a bit more stronger, proactive against Russia. And for example, Germany, that has more economic stakes involved in relationships with Russia, has been a bit more cautious. So there is that. However, I think we need to give credit to a very high degree of coordination and negotiation and finding a common ground that makes us unable to really distinguish that in some big degree, the nature of sanctions that comes from the European Union or the UK is really different. Of course, the we will see differences, because the amount of money in London, for example, is much higher than in any other city in Europe. So going after Russian oligarchs and Russian money would be of higher priority in London. So we could see differences, or the energy prices and the energy sanctions will hit more on Germany. So the and UK is not as dependent on Russian gas and oil. So energy sanctions have not been yet discussed as a response, though.
Well, many observers have described the current events, the Russian invasion in Ukraine, as a historic turning point. And how do you think will the new European security architecture look like that will emerge from this conflict, as well in regards to the roles of the EU and NATO?
Yeah, I agree with the assessment that this is a historical turning point in Europe and on the Eurasian continent, for Ukraine, for Russia, and for Europe as a whole. The early conversations before the Russian invasion about a new European security structure that would integrate Russia did make sense and were relevant, although already then it was clear that Russia would have to undergo an important political change of leadership before these conversations could be practical. With the invasion that is on the ground today, the conversation about integrating Russia at this point into European security architecture doesn't make sense. It has been sidelined and is not relevant anymore. What is relevant is increasing defense spending by European governments to strengthen their military defenses. What is relevant is the conversation about strengthening NATO and expanding NATO. Any sort of conversations about integrating Russia into the common European architecture would have to wait for the unfolding of events in Russia. We don't know what will happen to the Russian state, to the Russian society. We don't know what will happen to the Russian politics and political regime. And these political events would have to unfold, and new openings and new transformative moment might bring itself, maybe not tomorrow, maybe within months or years or many years. And after that, the conversation would have to be reignited about how to integrate Russia, how to give the Russian state, if it exists, the stakes to be interested in peace and stability in Europe.
Thank you for your assessment. Well, another question many people are currently asking themselves is what actually Putin's goals are in Ukraine. What is his strategy? What does he want to achieve?
You know, we can be guessing about his goals. I think what's seen from the rhetoric of the Russian government, of the recent rhetoric, is that the immediate goal for the Russian government is to what they say is to denazify Ukraine. What that means is to change the Ukrainian government, to overthrow Ukrainian government, and to install pro-Russian, pro-Kremlin government in Ukraine. I am highly skeptical that Russia has a capacity to maintain any sort of legitimacy for such a government if it is installed. So that's highly unlikely situation in the medium to long term. From my own perspective, the key central goal that I see for the Russian president today is to enact revenge to Ukraine and Ukrainian people and Ukrainian government that has chosen gradually and over the years to move away from Russia towards the West, towards Europe, towards the European Union and NATO. And this is really an act of revenge with the strategy that is rhetorically announced, but does it really exist in reality or not? I'm skeptical about the strategy. I do not see a rational and grounded strategy on the part of the Russian government and the Russian president. I see this as an act of revenge that is driven by affect, by sense of inferiority, and by the might that the Russian government now possesses with the military, and that enables it to go against Ukraine. But it can, where it thinks it might be fighting the Americans in Ukraine and Ukrainians as well, but it cannot go against the United States, but it can go against Ukraine. The biggest analogy that came to my mind with regards to my own comprehension of what is happening is the analogy with a jealous husband in Moscow in 2018, who took his wife to the forest with an axe and chopped her hands, both hands, with an axe as an act of jealousy. He was imprisoned for 14 years. It was a premeditated action, obviously thought through of what will happen. The wife couldn't believe until the end that he's going to do it. He did that. He got into jail. He did that because he could. It was rational but affect driven, and Putin's action in Ukraine is to an extent rational but affect driven, but without the strategy of what would happen. And so the situation is unfolding, and we will see what will happen.
Thank you. You have published in 2020 a book called The Red Mirror, Putin's Leadership and Russia's Insecure Identity. So you have done extensive research on Russian identity. Do you think that Putin is able to legitimate this conflict with Ukraine, or this invasion on the long term within Russia?
Let's talk first about short term. Any type of war and any type of context of confrontation of a country, of a group, of a collective with another group, collective, or a country brings a sense of unity within that group. And making Russia's national identity central to the perception of Russian citizens has worked really well for the Kremlin during 2014. Crimea annexation. I think that story of post-Crimea euphoria and an enormous hike in Putin's popularity provides the grounds for the Russian government and for Putin today to think and to expect similar unification and patriotism on the part of Russian. However, there is a big difference between 2022 and 2014. You know, as they say, the shell cannot fall into the same hole twice. And so these hopes that the Russian president might have are certainly not about to get realized. We do see a degree of unification on some parts of the Russian society, unification in a sense of support for Putin's decision to invade Ukraine. We do see that, but as big of a part of the society is against this invasion and is protesting, demonstrating, maybe not in such a massive numbers that could stop the invasion, but the statements of anti-war statements and statements of protest for invasion, we do see among different professional groups, among the petitions, the picketeers, collective, individual. This is all in the process of being unfolding as we speak today. So whatever hope that the Kremlin might have had for patriotic unification, it's not going to be similar to what Russia and the Russian government saw in 2014.
Thank you. You have called yourself the current strategy of the Kremlin to be irrational up to a certain degree. Do you think that Russian elites could turn at a certain point against the Russian government, or are they dissatisfied with the current turns of events? Because sanctions will definitely hurt them probably first.
You know, under normal circumstances of a country with pluralist elites, we might have high grounds for seeing what you suggest. I do want to point out that the selection of elites in Russia has occurred over the past many years. And this selection followed the principle of loyalty to a high degree. Plus, besides that loyalty principle, there is a principle of interest that the elites who are surrounding Putin today have high economic stakes in maintaining Putin in power, in maintaining their power and wealth along with Putin. And many of those billions that we see being lost today, doesn't take into account the other billions that are still kept and the opportunities that are still there for these elites to lead, more or less good lives as they had before. So combination of economic interest and combination with loyalty and political interest in maintaining Putin in power is going to work against big, massive splits. Nonetheless, I do not discount the possibility for a growing discontent of people around Putin against his decision. This invasion specifically and the meeting of the Council of Security Council showed a big divide between Putin, who puts himself at an upper level. There were many comparisons with Stalin and the logic of relationships between Stalin and his associates in the Soviet period, with what we saw demonstrated in this meeting between Putin and his associate that was on Monday, February 22nd, I guess, or 23rd. So that big gap between them is visible and tangible, and that does leave space for, creating certain groups, individuals who come together, trying to assess the risks involved in being associated with Putin. But at the same time, Putin also has his, generals like Viktor Zolotov, who are looking out for any sorts of conspiracies, for any sorts of splits, possible splits. So it's a carefully managed system. And while those splits are possible, there are also factors that go against this visible fragmentation of what we call collective Putin, of people who are around him.
Thank you. You've just mentioned as well the Soviet Union, and the comparisons to the Soviet Union are currently made a lot. Could you shed light on the role of post-Soviet continuities in thinking and probably in this logic of invading Ukraine?
Yes, my book, The Red Mirror, Putin's Leadership and Russia's Insecure Identity, integrates a lot of thinking about the Soviet legacy and the place of the Soviet legacies in contemporary political situation, and also in our attempts to make sense of public opinion in Russia. And the case that I made in the book was that current regime, current leadership used the mechanisms of collective identity consolidation that have been used by the Soviet government and by the Soviet leaders. So after the Soviet collapse, the Russian society found itself a bit ungrounded, or a lot ungrounded, not only economically and socially, but also symbolically in terms of understanding what Russia is about, who they are as Russian citizens. And during Putin's presidency in the already 21st century, over the last 2 decades, we saw a very clear narrative advanced by the state-controlled media, by the pro-Kremlin media, about what Russia is about. And I see the revival of 2 very important pillars of Soviet collective identity. One pillar, an idea and believe in Soviet exceptionalism, that the Soviet state and therefore Soviet citizens who are part of the Soviet state are part of this exceptional state with a mission, with a certain degree of superiority in comparison to others. This sense of exceptionalism has been revived in Russia over the past years as well. And the other side of the coin of this sense of superiority and exceptionalism, cultural exceptionalism, Russia as a special civilization, millennial civilization, the other side of the coin is that our country, Russia, and then Soviet Union, is surrounded by foreign enemies. I grew up in the Soviet Union. I remember my education in Soviet schools, and all the history books were based on describing how the Soviet state from early on was surrounded by enemies. The nature of enemies has changed. It was first the enemies of the capitalist encirclement for the Bolshevik government, then there was Nazi Germany as an enemy, and then there was an imperialist enemy in the face of the United States, number one, but there was also South Africa with apartheid. So the enemy was there throughout the whole of the 70 years of Soviet existence. In the 1990s, Russia didn't have enemies. Those enemies were revived during Putin, specifically after 2000, starting with 2007, Putin's speech in Munich, but very clearly in a very broad and propagandistic manner after 2012-13, and especially after 2014. So this revival of the image of the enemy that is surrounding our country and along with Russian exceptionalism are two elements. But I should also note that the basis of the regime and the national consolidation that we see, and this is another part of the book, is not only the Soviet legacy. A big chunk of it is constructing trauma of the 1990s transition, right? On the cultural level, on the societal level, the narrative that Russia went through victimhood of the 1990s resonated really strongly. And the Kremlin and the state-based propaganda saw that resonance and used it in the political way to support Putin's presidency. And it is on the back of perceiving Russia as a victim in the hands of oligarchs, the West, the whatever foreign and domestic enemies and forces that wanted Russia's disintegration, that wanted Russia's failure, that placed Russia on its knees in the 1990s. It is on this back of perceiving 90s as this black hole, as this trauma period, that we see the revival and the resonance of ideas of Russian exceptionalism, strength, hope, and superiority, along with Russia being surrounded by the enemies. It just made sense to many Russians, and Putin's popularity and the Kremlin's support in many ways was based on that, and to a large degree still has those ideas in place working, not to such a great degree as it has worked after 2014, but still quite widespread in the Russian population.
Thank you very much. So would you like to additional point in regards to the current situation in Ukraine? Because these were now all questions from my side.
Yes, for the contemporary situation, for current situation in Ukraine, I think what is important right now is that, number one, we do see that the Russian hopes for a very quick overturning of the Ukrainian statehood and sovereignty and political control have not come true. And, as with many people, I am watching at what's happening on the ground and standing with those who support Ukrainian cities today from the Russian army. And if they hold on for longer, that goes against the Kremlin's plans, and that goes against the illusions that should work to change the Russian societal attitudes of those who have been hoping and who have supported this invasion. So I'm just, you know, as a spectator, but with certain political views, watching out what will happen. It's a big tragedy. I'm devastated personally to see what is happening. And there is not much analysis and clear or cold thinking that could be advanced at this point, as we are the spectators who are looking at what is happening, the unthinkable war that has been taken by the criminal Russian government and by the criminal Russian president. I think he needs to respond for the decisions made. I think the lines were crossed.
Thank you, Professor Sharafutdinova, for sharing your points of view and giving us interesting insights into Russia and Russian politics.
Thank you very much, Lucas. It's my duty to share my thoughts about this today.